Please give a very warm welcome to Edan and to our panelists.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Zócalo and the Getty Center. I'm going to quickly introduce these illustrious panelists. They are the real deal. Right here is Raina MacIntyre. She's an epidemiologist and global biosecurity scholar at the University of New South Wales. She has pioneered research in the prediction, control, and prevention of pandemics and bioterrorism. She has also published on how scientific research intended to benefit humanity may ultimately harm humanity. Next to her is Liam Young. He is a speculative architect and futurist at SCI-Arc. His work examines the invisible connections and systems that make the modern world work. He is also the co-founder of the think tank Tomorrow's Thoughts Today, which explores the local and global implications of new technologies. And at the end here, we have Jonathan Wong. He goes by John, just FYI. He is a defense policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. A former US Marine, his work focuses on how new technologies and intelligence strategies are shaping the way militaries fight. Thank you guys for being here. I'm really excited to get to talk to you. I thought the first place we might start is to talk about technology because, at least among my peers and people I talk to, that seems to be what tends to scare people, and also at the same time is what is empowering people. John,
thank you.
John, you told us that your perspective on this topic might be, and I quote here from an email, best summed up as a perspective on how large organizations like governments and corporations deal with change. For instance, you recently wrote about the Pentagon's move to hire a chief innovation officer, and you had concerns about how a huge bureaucracy might not be nimble enough to face technological changes and make fast decisions as needed. So I guess I'm curious how your specialized knowledge informs your view on how governments can work or don't work in kind of tumultuous times.
Yeah, and I would say that, having been once a member of the world's largest bureaucracy, about 2 million people, and now someone that studies it, on a day-to-day basis, at first when I wrote that article about how the Pentagon was trying to capture up the innovation that Silicon Valley, for instance, is well known for, and trying to figure out how they can do it for themselves, I was pretty skeptical about it. But now, about a year and a half later, I'm actually quite impressed with the way that this largest of bureaucracies has been able to take that, what I thought was once a fad, and really bring it around and take it to heart. And a couple things kind of stand out to me. So, for the U.S. military, and this is just the way that they do things. When they buy a weapon, for instance, they often try to think about all the ways they want to use it, and then figure out the best thing design the best thing that can do that, and then deploy it from there. And that usually takes a long time, and that's where you get a lot of the criticisms of how it works and how expensive it is to us, the taxpayer, and so on and so forth. What I've been finding is that they've been really flipping that entire playbook on its head. The kind of Byzantine process by which they do that. They're now seeing that innovation is coming from the outside, and they need to adapt to it. That the new things, new research, new developments are coming from outside the Pentagon, and they're really, I think, doing a really good job capturing it. If you had asked me about a year ago whether I felt that a bureaucracy as large as the Pentagon was able to be nimble and make decisions quickly, I would have scoffed. But I think now I'm a little bit less skeptical. I'll put it that way.
All right. Do you think, you see that businesses, like employees and shareholders at places like Amazon are really pushing for the company to act on things like climate change. Do you think that's having that's having an effect on how the government is deciding to work? Oh,
absolutely. And when I was thinking about this for a little bit of my time, I was as a management consultant, as many young people my age seem to do at one point or another, and I was really curious about how corporations make their decisions. And I found that for the government, and I think this is the key difference here, the governments make decisions by analyzing something, really trying to figure out exactly what the right answer is, because they really feel like they only have one shot because they're beholden to us, the taxpayers, the voters, to get it right the first time. Companies, I found, I was a consultant for a while, they make decisions fast, they see if it works, it doesn't work, they pivot, they do something else, and they iterate faster and faster and faster. And what I've been finding the government is now able to do, at least the US government increasingly has been able to pivot just a little bit faster. It's still a big ship, there's still a lot of, a large inertia behind it, but it has been surprisingly been more nimble in recent years, at least the bureaucracy, in kind of responding to changes and changes in the outside context.
All right. So civilization is not going to collapse.
Well,
yay or nay?
I mean that's a.
Well.
Yeah. It's funny because a bureaucracy is meant to regularize and systematize processes. It's not meant for chaos, to deal with a new situation, with new chaos. And this is what they're faced with now. And I think, and to some of the expertise from my other panelists, it still remains a challenge for them because, by definition, the bureaucracy is meant to carry out things on a regular basis over a long period of time in a regular, systematic, kind of consistent way.
Raina. It's interesting. I was told I was getting this panel, and I was delivered the panelists, and I was like, whoa, this is the most interesting dinner party I've ever been invited to. How are they ever going to connect? And then there were all these really interesting threads. And Raina, when I started looking into your work, you do a lot of work thinking about technology and how established systems aren't equipped to deal with the pace of technological development, and maybe, they're not meant to deal with chaos, as John said. In one paper of yours that I read, you wrote, advances in biological sciences have occurred at a faster rate than changes in regulatory and legal frameworks for biosecurity. Some of your paper kind of chilled my spine a little bit. Can you talk about technology and how it has the capacity to keep us safer, to cure diseases, to come up with vaccines, but also harm us? What's the dark side of technology as you see it?
Sure. So, I think biosecurity is very analogous to cybersecurity, where the technology has gone ahead in leaps and bounds, but we are still using regulatory frameworks from last century which are no longer fit for purpose. One of the examples there is genetic engineering. There's been attempts to genetically engineer pathogens, organisms, for a long time, including in the Soviet bioweapons program back in the 1960s and 70s, but they were using very crude technology. In about 2012, a new method called CRISPR-Cas9 was developed, and that's revolutionized gene editing. So you can edit anything with DNA, plants, animals, viruses, human beings. You've probably heard that a Chinese scientist created engineered babies this year, and that was highly controversial. In fact, they've been editing human embryos in the UK and in Sweden since 2016, but not carried them through to live births. So in this era where we can create new bugs that are more pathogenic, more dangerous, etc., there is a real risk that we'll face a pandemic that is man-made, that may either result from a laboratory accident or deliberate release. And in terms of deliberate release, if you publish the methods to hack a bank account on the internet, what's the probability that somebody will use those methods? It's 100%. And it's the same with you publish methods to create a biological weapon, what's the probability somebody will use it? It's 100% in my view. Human beings have always wanted to harm other human beings or some human beings. It's happened throughout history, and if you provide people with methods to harm, they will use those methods. And many people refer to biological weapons as the poor man's nuke, because it's much more accessible than nuclear weapons. Nuclear technology is very difficult to access, much more challenging for perpetrators.
I told you, spine chilling. Even in the green room, we were talking, and you brought up a couple times different scenarios of bad actors, of things that could happen. And I guess this is a later question I had for you, but in your specialized work, do you feel that this gives you agency in terms of feeling like a kind of sense of understanding how the world works now, or it can work, or does it keep you up at night?
it keeps me up at night because, infectious diseases have weapons of mass destruction potential, and sometimes people who tinker with this stuff and do it for whatever reason may think that they can play God, but I don't believe anyone can play God when it comes to releasing a pathogen. There's always something you wouldn't have anticipated. It's something we need to think about in terms of regulation. So there's, in 2017, a Canadian scientist synthesized from scratch with $100,000 in mail-order DNA an extinct pox virus that's very closely related to smallpox. And that is now published in an open access journal, not behind a paywall, which means the methods are out there, and it means that anyone could create smallpox in a laboratory just by following those methods. And that's what's really kind of had people concerned in the last couple of years, the threat of re-emergence of smallpox in an era where, when smallpox was eradicated, the first heart-lung transplant hadn't occurred. Bone marrow transplant was in its infancy. We now live in societies where there's quite high levels of immunosuppression. Maybe 1 in 5 people live with significant medical immunosuppression. So what would the impact of something like that be today?
Yeah. The scientist who posted the paper, what was their, I assume, because scientists seem like nice people generally, that there was a reason for that research for good, or is that the question?
Yes, he had reasons and, justified his research, but interestingly, I think the FBI and other intelligence agencies supposedly gather intelligence to try and detect planning for biological weapons. Nobody picked this up, and no one knew about this experiment until the scientists told the WHO after the event, after it had been done.
Oh, wow.
So we don't even have systems to pick up this kind of research that's going on.
Wow. So you're on the side of yay in terms of civilization collapsing.
I think it's possible.
There's a tally going on. There's a Liam, you and I are like the unreal people here. So
I'm totally intimidated. You guys do the real stuff. We just tell stories.
I work at a think tank. I don't make anything.
I watched a presentation that you gave at the Met in New York City. It was really fascinating. And you talked about your work and some of the films that you make, which I would say unpack like a simplistic vision of the future that's often handed to us by technology companies mostly. Like your phone is going to give you this simple, easy life with everything's going to be white. Everyone's smooth surfaces like a Mac store. And your work seems to really take in the complexity of technology. One of your films that you talked about, maybe you can tell us more about it, but you talked about you kind of dramatized the different possible uses for drones. Like a drone could walk a dog, a drone can be used for surveillance, a drone can be a weapon of war, but could also be like a way to hack into sending love letters between 2 teenagers. And you had this great quote, which I have to admit, I had to listen. I watched the video like 100 times to get this transcription, but my husband was like, that's really interesting, after he'd heard it like 1,000 times. We were really pretty into it, so I'm just going to read it here. You said, "So often now, futures are presented to us through the rhetoric of these kind of efficiencies and problem solving through technology, and they're marketed to us through these cute icons and graphics of the smart city. The management of the city, which was once publicly elected, is now outsourced to proprietary software systems, and public services begin to disappear into the cloud, which leads to the question, do we become customers or citizens of our cities?" Which I thought was such a good question. But again, we're kind of returning to like the double-edged nature of technology. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about your work and how maybe a more nuanced view and understanding of technology can give us a nuanced view of the future.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I tell stories, but I do think there's a real important way of thinking about how we talk about technologies when answering these kind of questions about whether they're good or bad, because it's impossible to separate technology from culture. So what we do through stories is prototype the different ways that culture assimilates or takes on certain technologies and prototypes the different things that we can do with them. Because I don't think any of the technologies that we're talking about that may either bring about collapse or save us from that collapse are inherently good or evil, are productive or negative. They're just extensions of ourselves. You know, like all of these technologies, whether it's biotech or certain military tech or drones or driverless cars or whatever is the technology du jour, they're all exaggerations of who we are. They're equal parts fear and wonder, because in many ways so are we. So I'm interested in the ways that our culture engages with these tech and what we do with them. You know, and we're good at really doing two things. We're good at selling each other technology. We're good at, you know, getting up on stage with a big screen behind us and launching the new iPhone, and it's going to make us happier, better connected, easier to talk to our mothers. They're going to give us better orgasms, whatever it is. You know, we're sold tech from one particular angle. In a way, that's a kind of a dominant media narrative that surrounds it. Then the other way we talk about technology, and especially in this town, is from really dystopian perspective. You know, the aliens are invading. We need something that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is going to fight against. So it's technology out of control. It's biotech gone wrong. The drones are invading, or the aliens, or whatever it is. We can do that really well also, because it plays on all of our fears. What we're really bad at is talking about nuanced relationships to technology. When Elon Musk gets on stage and presents the new Tesla battery or the Powerwall or his green energy vision of a future that's going to be all solar, it sounds really great and hopeful, but it's also at the same time a very easy and simplistic view of what the future is going to look like. He should also be talking up on stage about where all the lithium that is a component in his batteries comes from. And I don't think we're incapable of understanding those subtleties to his vision. But for whatever reason, they avoid those questions. So we try and create stories in our films that talk about the different ways that technology becomes enculturated, the complexities, the misuses of technology, the positive and negative outcomes, to try and prototype and imagine what technologies we should have in our world, as opposed to the technologies that are kind of thrust upon us. Because most of the time, the stuff that arrives comes at us not because it's going to make our lives better, but because it can be sold to us. And we need to become much more active agents in controlling and asking questions of the technologies that we want to have in our lives, as opposed to just waiting in line for the next iPhone to be released and hoping it's going to do something awesome, which it doesn't.
Do either of you have anything to respond to that? I'm just curious about what you think about, you know, if things are simplified for us for capitalistic reasons, and if we look at things with a little bit more complexity, then maybe we can problem solve a little bit more, and we have more agency in understanding how the world is working and what role we play in it.
Oh, absolutely. I would shake my head more furiously if this microphone didn't fall off.
It's taped on.
It is. But Liam, to your point, it really is, technology really is an extension of ourselves. And the background that I come from, particularly when I was in the Marine Corps, at that time, we were thrust with all these different technologies, particularly to stop roadside bombs. This is just one small kind of microcosm case, but in a very kind of a pressure cooker environment where, you know, we were given different technologies to try out and see if we could stop, you know, or prevent or mitigate some of these roadside bombs that were harming and maiming and killing many of us. And what I always thought was really curious were all these technologists that, particularly in the first years of that conflict, when it really got bad, 2003 and 2004, you know, they had a vision of what this technology could do. This thing can jam this frequency that this roadside bomb transmits on, and we'd bring it out there, and the enemy would find another way around it, which is what you would expect them to do. We didn't really get good at that, at adapting to that, until those technologists not only thought about the ways that they could conceive of some counter to that, but they really started communicating with us in real time. Is this working? Is that working? No, I think you should do this. I think you should do that. And that conversation was, I think, the kind of thing that you're looking for, Liam. The interaction, the interplay, the agency to not just have technology thrust upon us, but to actually kind of try to define what it might be and what it can do for us. Ultimately, I think it really did kind of stem the flow over time. By about 2009, the last time I was in Iraq, it became that the roadside bomb problem was much reduced because of that interaction, which didn't happen before. And I really thought that was really interesting. I didn't think so at the time because I was a little busy, but in later years, I realized what a sea change it was when we really started talking to those technologists back in the States that were trying to help us as best they could, but could only imagine so far as to how they could help us.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned it as well, Rana. Like, I think one of the conditions that the increasing pace of technology sets in motion is that they're all what I describe as before culture technologies. They've arrived faster than our cultural capacity to understand what they mean has, or they've certainly arrived, as you mentioned, faster than our legal understanding of their consequences are. We're still, just a few weeks ago, I think Kim.com, that guy in New Zealand that launched Mega Upload, is still fighting his extradition to the United States on file piracy charges. And this is 15 years after that first set in motion. We still don't understand what data piracy is versus when I read a book and I enjoyed it and I give it to you, that's sharing. But if I download a movie and I put it on a drive and give it to you because I enjoyed it, that's file piracy. We're still trying to create that legislation, and Napster was generated 20 years ago. So what we do in telling stories is try and prototype the possible implications of these futures and technologies before they happen, so that perhaps we can reverse engineer some of those outcomes to get ahead of the game a little bit and start to put in place preemptive regulation, to start to put in place preemptive action or procedures to mitigate against either the positive outcomes to mitigate either the negative outcomes of these technologies or scaffold the potential for potentially productive outcomes of these technologies. So I think we're really bad at long-term thinking, and when it comes to technologies and the speed that they arrive, that's fundamental to engaging with them in meaningful and productive ways.
Anything to add, Raina?
Well, I think the reliance on technology that we have now also makes us very vulnerable in the event of a natural disaster or any other kind of disaster. It's mega cities which are technologically enabled that are going to be hardest hit, and it'll be rural and remote areas and countries that have subsistence living that will be more resilient because they've got basic survival skills and means, whereas people in big cities who need their Wi-Fi connection, their car, their all their gadgets and so on, it'll be very difficult to deal.
This panel is called "Is Civilization on the Verge of Collapse?" And of course I have to ask the question, what do we mean when we say civilization? When we ask if civilization is under threat of collapsing, whose civilization are we talking about? Because I think, right, we have to ask that question. Do any of you have an answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, my answer to the broad question is civilization has always been collapsing. I mean, whether it's coincidence or by design, you have two Australians on this panel. If you had an Indigenous Australian on this panel, they would have said their civilization collapsed in the 1970s. It's not something of the future, it's something that's already happened in many ways. So I think it's important to understand the perspective from which we're exploring civilization and what collapse actually means. So I think there's that caveat which we need to put in place to a certain extent. But I guess I'm presuming that the panel is kind of framing it in terms of civilization, like the glossy, shiny futures that we all enjoy in a city like Los Angeles. And in that sense, you have to wonder, like a collapse is probably due in many ways. Like the extent to which we can go on living with the luxuries that we have is something that's worth discussing and questioning.
John, I think I asked you in the email if this game of is the world ending or not, is that kind of a parlor game of the privileged? I mean, you have worked in places where you said had shaky governance, and I'm just curious what you learned about being in places like Iraq during war, and has it added to your perspective in this question of what happens after something really terrible happens? People go on.
Yeah, it really gives me a sense of optimism, actually, strangely enough. And this is not to downplay the trauma that Iraqi society in particular, which I have kind of a little bit of experience with, has undergone for many decades now. But it struck me when I was there, particularly around 2007. This was a time when Al-Qaeda in Iraq, now ISIS, was really had a hold of many of the cities in Western Iraq where I was at, Hadith in particular. And they were killing people in the streets. They were, you just didn't know, if you're in Iraq, you didn't know if you're going to live to the next day. But what I always found when I patrolled and was out in the city was resilience. It was people that were still laughing, that were still seeing the sunset on the Euphrates River, that were still cooking, that were still doing all the things that in one way, shape, or form are recognizable to me and to us and to all of us in the audience as regular, normal, day-to-day existence. And that has always stuck with me, that even in that traumatized time, and that wasn't the last degradation they had to endure, they were still living and they were still making the best of it. So it gives me some sense of optimism that even if society did collapse, that somehow we collectively, civilization would go on. And I'm really struck by your comment, Liam, about the Aboriginal people and the perspective that they might have, which is that it has already happened to them.
Anything to add, Raina? As our second Aussie on the panel, I mean, what is this?
In terms
Let's
of
party.
When taken over, it's going to happen.
the Aussie coffee shops, have you been to them? I've heard there's lots in LA.
Yeah, flat white, please. That's my terrible Australian accent.
So I think in terms of the definition of civilization, I think it's technologically enabled civilization that we're talking about, wherever you are in the world. The truth is we live in a very globalized, interconnected world with just-in-time economies where, our supplies and our parts are coming from all over the world. And that, I think, is a very fragile ecosystem and under threat for a lot of reasons, and not just geopolitical issues, but also I think it's quite well recognised that there are a bunch of technological issues that could be an existential threat to humanity altogether, including biological events, the natural disasters like a meteorite strike, but cyber security issues, as well as things like nanobots and all kinds of new technological threats that have the capacity to threaten the survival of our species. So, yeah, to me it's technological civilization.
Yeah.
And I thought of the title as Existential Threats to Humanity. Yeah.
And we've been telling these stories as humans forever, right? I would assume from the beginning of time that our time is coming up. And I think we've always kind of understood we have so much vast power on this planet, but then also such vulnerability. So I'm wondering what is different about our end of the world fears now. I mean, is it precisely because we live in such a technological world now that we couldn't? I mean, I live on the east side. I grew up here. I had to use my phone to know how to get here. My Thomas Guide is long gone, alas. But do you think that's at the heart of our current kind of crisis about this? Or is it just a rerun of what we've always feared?
Well, I think about it. I have 2 young kids at home, 2 and 4, and sometimes I would not want my son to bump into this coffee table and bump his head. But at the same time, I want him to learn to kind of adapt to it. And I think about us as civilization, not as exactly as my 2 and 4-year-old are, but there are very few things that are absolutely game over, like sticking a fork in an electrical socket. And I think in terms of civilization and where we've been and the struggles that we have kind of undergone collectively, we've had some pretty close calls. The place I work now, Rand Corporation, was instrumental in trying and struggling to figure out how to use nuclear weapons and to use them in a way where we would survive and we would go on, which is just impossible. But one of the things I did when I first started working there was kind of look at some of the notes from that time, just because I was really curious. And some of the brightest minds at that point were certain, absolutely certain, that we were going to end in a giant fireball. That it was just like, no matter what we did, that there was more than even odds that we would all be consumed by an atomic fireball at some point. And it didn't happen. It hasn't happened yet. And so we've gotten through that somehow. We created the frameworks to have a dialogue with the Soviet Union at that time to eventually tamp things down. We created, people created the political will to conduct arms control agreements. So I think the only difference between that time, for instance, and now is that we're getting close to the fork in the socket moment. That there are things, and Reina, you pointed out that nuclear weapons were the province of state actors, and that some of these biosecurity threats or cyber threats are accessible to so many more people. And so that part does absolutely worry me. That the proliferation and the accessibility of these threats that have these outsized effects is more than what we've seen before.
I think one of the other issues, John, is that we've seen a convergence of nefarious actors. So even 10, 15 years ago, terrorism was a silo there, organised crime over here. There wasn't much interaction between them, but things like the dark web have now enabled unprecedented collusion and collaboration between different nefarious actors, whether it's state actors, terrorist groups, or organised crime. So now I think law enforcement people agree that it's organised crime is financing terrorism, and there's very close connections, and that's the part that's really hard to get a handle on, combined with the accessibility of technology. But the other thought I had was just about artificial intelligence, the whole idea of the singularity, when some people argue we've already reached
near,
that.
Right? Isn't the singularity near? Isn't that what people say?
Well, some people say it already has occurred, don't they? That machines in some ways are as intelligent or can do more than the human brain can. I mean, I don't think that's true in all areas. There's certain things where human intelligence can't be replicated by a machine yet, but that might come, and what happens then.
It's interesting that's a concept from storytelling, the AI singularity.
Yeah. I mean, the science fiction authors have been very great at prototyping all kinds of dystopian fears. And I mean, when I make my films, like traveling and going to these places around the world is a big part of that, because there's now a cliched quote in Futures from the science fiction author William Gibson, who says that the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I try and take that at face value, and what that means is I can get on a plane and travel to pockets of the future that are existing in the present tense and kind of document them. And a lot of our world building for film in this town comes from those observations of going to those places. So there's ways where you can see these emerging trends playing out in real time. You just have to be attuned to them and kind of be aware of them. And I think there we can again start to prototype the possible implications of some of these possible futures or trends or disasters. But I think in many ways the reason why we're having a panel like this now, and I have the word futurist in my bio, so I get invited to lots of these kind of things, is because I think right now it's different from the various apocalypse that have come before us, because it's no longer just fear of the nuclear age. It's now fear of nuclear, biotech, AI, technology out of control, massive climate change, economic collapse. Like, there are so many balls in the air, any one of which could fall and destroy everything. Like, there's so many apocalypses coming.
Choose your own adventure.
Yeah, choose your own version of how civilization ends right now. And I think that's part of the reason why now is different. And it's also part of the reason why the future is becoming a project again. There's a revival of sci-fi and fantasy because, at times of crisis, the sightings of UFOs increase, because we want to try and figure it out as a culture. We want to try and tell stories about all these different possible outcomes. to try and get ourselves ready somehow. So I think now is a moment different from the others because it's all coming at us. There's no singular enemy. We just don't know how any of these things may play out, and that's pretty scary.
It seems to me, too, that there's not really nobody's controlling the narrative. There's no master narrative anymore. It's all sort of broken down. So we know what's happening around the world at all times with the click of a button. And we have all these voices, which is a benefit, right? All these people can tell different stories, but then that can be a little bit troubling too, right? When it's like, well, which disaster will happen, right? Liam, I wonder if you would talk a little bit about this book that your think tank put out called Machine Landscapes, Architectures of the Post-Anthropocene?
Post-Anthropocene, yeah.
Did I get it right?
Yes. Yeah, when we first started writing the book, it was called Architectures of the Anthropocene, and the book took so long to come out that it's now the Post-Anthropocene. So my
Publishing is pretty slow.
My joke is the publishing industry moves slower than geological epochs.
Can you define that word, Anthropocene?
Anthropocene. So that's, we often talk about it in kind of panels like this. It's a word that we've, through some kind of consensus of scientists and philosophers, we've come to this idea that we're now in a geological age where humans are the dominant force shaping the planet. So like the human, is now shaping our Earth. And if you think about it, in many ways that's true. We have remade and reshaped every inch of our globe for our own ends. We've geoengineered the entirety of the planet to deliver fruit that's out of season, to give us energy, to build an iPhone. That's an extraordinarily complex piece of technology that you can't produce in one place. There's no such thing as the local iPhone. It's a really global object, and we've engineered the planet as this kind of global conveyor belt in order to deliver these luxuries for our life. So that's the Anthropocene. And I guess the provocation of that book is to talk about the post-Anthropocene, which a number of other thinkers are on at the moment, which is to say that we've kind of already come out of that mode, actually, that now humans aren't the dominant force shaping the planet, but it's the machines that we've designed that are. It's the algorithms that we write. It's the AI that we set in motion. These are the things that are now making the choices that are reshaping our world. So this book was a kind of a survey of all of the landscape conditions, the architectures and the systems, things like data centers, fully autonomous shipping ports, Amazon fulfillment centers. These are the entities, the infrastructures that make our world, that sit at the center of our lives, but they're also entirely invisible. They're sites that we will never visit, that we don't have access to. They're literal human exclusion zones. And it represents a massive shift in our culture that, the church, the home, now the museum or the gallery, these used to be the center points of our cultural imagining. Now it's the Amazon fulfillment center or the Facebook data center. But it's different because we don't go to lectures on Wednesday nights in the Facebook data center in Prineville, Oregon.
Well, if you're hip, you get invited to those.
Sorry?
If you're really hip, you get to go there.
You get invited to the lobby, but you're not allowed into where the servers are.
Yeah.
These are the cultural typologies of our age, though, and yet they're entirely unmanned and unstaffed. So I was interested in if we're thinking about civilization, if we're talking about collapse, if we're talking about our future, what does it mean to be remaking our world at the scale that we are? What does it mean to be creating technologies that are doing that for us? I think these are interesting questions.
I think this is fascinating. Yeah. Let the experts weigh in on this. Either of you have any response to that?
Well, I was going to say, it's interesting that, Liam, you kind of phrased it in the post-Anthropocene in that we will kind of, we're just kind of letting machines kind of do their will upon us. And it's interesting, as you're discussing that, it occurred to me that as long as you have agency and the ability to respond to that and to react to it in some way, whatever it may be, that the story isn't quite over yet. And the mere fact that you're sitting here talking about it, and I'm listening intently to it, again, gives me some sense of optimism that if we were truly in that post-Anthropocene age, we would be humming along just moving along just fine, just like, I don't know, that Disney movie WALL-E.
Yeah, I was going to say WALL-E.
Humming along, being anesthetized by their TV screens in front of their faces. The mere thought that you and others are thinking about it gives me a sense of optimism.
Yeah. I mean, I think, like, I don't want to be the guy sitting here saying, oh, we're all doomed, technology shit. I mean, it may not sound like it good. I'm inherently a techno-optimist, actually. I think what's interesting about this moment is we're in the belly of the beast, right? Like, we can see all of these possible futures. They haven't happened yet, which is a really powerful place to be, on the cutting edge of the possibility for change. But what it means is the decisions we make now really matter. Like our future, the projections of civilization collapsing by 2050, all of this stuff it comes back to this point right now at this moment in the decisions we make. And that's why I think it's actually a really exciting question. And it's not a question that should fill you with dread and fear, but it's a question that should really be a call to arms and a rallying cry. And whether or not you're in a think tank or a biosecurity agency, or you're a Hollywood producer making a film with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, the decisions that you make through all of those movements, can mean something, And then to talk to your point about the network creating a condition that all these different actors come together, the other potential of the network is that through things like hashtag activism or the Facebook group that organized the Women's March, the same network that collide together organized crime and terrorism can also organize more humans than in all of our entire history to come together to protest a president or to rally around climate change. So it's also exciting, and it's also really optimistic that if we point the network and these technologies in the right direction, we can act at scales that might actually mean something in the face of the scale of these problems that we're coming across.
In the event that civilization does collapse, why not? Let's go there. The panel asks, what are the risks of human society returning to the darkness of the early Middle Ages? I also wonder, what would the pleasures and the surprises be? I think that's part of the fantasy. It's a nightmare, but it's also the fantasy, right? My phone wouldn't work anymore, and I wouldn't be able to do this or that, and suddenly, of course, I would survive. In the fantasy, you're one of the last remaining people. My contacts are going to dry up, and my husband's asking us, it's not going to work, and it's over for us. But, Raina, what do you think? Are there any? Do you think? You started as a physician, right? And then you moved into working more doing this research and stuff. But you worked people to people, and I'm curious, have you thought about if it swung in the other way, if it went backwards?
Well, I think, if there was a catastrophic event that I think it's known that the Earth can only support 1 million people with the energy of the sun and no other, technology, which is how it was. And one of the good things, I suppose, for those 1 million people would be that they'd probably be having more sex because they won't have electricity. So in the old days, people used to go to bed at 5 p.m. as soon as it got dark. They didn't stay up and watch TV or whatever. So, they'd have more sex and have more children.
Side note, in California, in my book, I have my characters, I think, having sex only 3 times in a 6-week period. The number of complaining reviews online that the characters were having too much sex, I was really concerned with the prudishness of American readers. But I agree. What do you guys think?
Well, I was thinking that it would be, this is a bit macabre, but I would think that it would be a very nice reset. Don't people actually do that now? Like they kind of have these detoxes where they try to take away all their technology and they kind of live in the present purposefully as a means of kind of resetting themselves. It would be that on a massive scale, right? I think that would be the greatest pleasure. It would be hitting the reset button. It would be whether it's 1 million or whatever the number is to start all over again. think that doesn't sound appealing for most of us, myself included. But the thought of the one kind of thing I wonder about is like how much of the knowledge of what had transpired would transfer to those 1 million people, just as knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans survived in one way or another through the medieval times. I wonder how.
Can I interrupt you there, John?
Sure.
Because knowledge largely is digital today, right?
It is
in those times, we could look up stone tablets or books. There's going to be a lot of knowledge lost.
Certainly, I think a lot of knowledge would be lost, but as I pick up my paper copy of the LA Times, and there's still a significant, I think still enough that I wonder how much of that would transfer on to the future. Obviously not all of it, because we create, so much more information in the digital realm than we do in print or in stone or what have you, but I would say that some of it would probably move on. I just wonder what we would do with it, what we would learn from it.
Well, I want to thank our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. Jonathan and Raina.
Possible. Andrea has the first question on the left.
Thank you. My name is Meir Bartou, and I have a question whether civilization is the tools we use or the value system and the emotional connectivity among people, meaning is the collapse of civilization comes from a tool collapse or from a value system collapse?
Was that tools collapse or value system?
Tools, you spoke about the sense of biological hazards, nuclear hazard, the effect of technology. All of those are tools. Mm-hmm. They are tools that are being used by people that have a value system. Mm-hmm. Value system controls tools of civilization. Mm-hmm. We keep on getting forward, but civilization will collapse based on value collapse, I think, and not tools collapse.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, and in answer to your question, and maybe the question that you ended on as well, I think the kind of collapse that we're worried about is the collapse of our values. And if there's one productive thing about this question or this form of collapse that you're talking about, I mean, I'm all for the more sex option. But although I certainly don't want to live in a world without Netflix, you can kill me now.
Just the chill part will be left.
Just chill. The future is just chill. I think if we slightly shift our value system, one of the productive things about our civilization collapsing is there might be more birds, there'll probably be more fish in the ocean. The planet might have a chance to recover from this Anthropocene that we were talking about earlier. So often this question is answered or talked about from the point of view of a very human-centric relationship to the world around us. That the planet is here to serve us, and oh God, our collapse, that's going to be terrible. But actually the best thing that could happen is that, somehow the human race diminishes because it gives everything else a chance to get back in the game a little bit. So that may be one valuable thing or productive things that comes out of it. And I think it points to this question of value. Like how long can we keep on going, putting us at the center of all the decisions that we make? We talk in my world in design, we talk about human-centered design as being this catch cry and this thing that ends in like tree-lined streets and people having coffee on sidewalks. I'm really interested in moving forward what it means to talk about atmospheric-centered design or wetland-centered design or whooping crane-centered design and what that would look like. I think that's an interesting question to explore.
Hey guys, another Australian. Simon Bell is my name. Unlike Rainy here, and I wrote this down, so excuse me, I personally don't believe that humans are born wanting to harm each other. It seems to me that overpopulation and the competition for resources is really what drives all violence and virtually all of the existential threats you've discussed here. And yet people still see procreation as the fundamental purpose of life. Do you think we need to change that narrative? And if so, how? And what would be your new narrative for the purpose of life for humans?
I actually was wondering this, Reina, because you were talking about backstage and here about people who could come in and like mess with your medical records to look like you had a tumor when you didn't. And I was thinking, well, why would someone be so mean? Which is such a Pollyanna thing to think. But I wonder what is behind people who are are truly desperate for something. And if that didn't exist, if you could take that away, and that's a side question to like changing the narrative again, procreation being the thing that we need to do.
I'm not sure about the answer to your question, to be honest, but in my view, one of the problems we face is in our inherent nature. Human nature is selfish. Human nature is, people are corruptible. Very few people live a truly good and honest life. People can be easily swayed to do the wrong thing, whether it's something that's going to harm the planet or harm other people. I think that's just the story of human history, and it's something we've got to. I don't think just procreation is the answer. We need to think about the consequences of our actions globally.
I mean, if a people-centered world is unsustainable, right? Then what? Jonathan, what should we do?
It is sustainable, but it requires technology. We need genetically modified food. We need, meat grown in a lab. We need to overcome the dependence on agriculture. Then we can sustain. We do sustain the population of the world with technology.
My name is Petr Kucharski, and I have a question about narrative, but from a socio-economic point of view. Do you think that the fact that after the collapse of the communism starting from 1989 and after the economic crisis in 2008, are we suffering or maybe enjoying the lack of the dominant socioeconomic narrative that can organize everything, can give hope, maybe like this hope of we will be super rich and super happy with our capitalism? And if yes, what could be the new narrative?
I mean, I don't think, in terms of particularly the last, the 2008 economic crisis, I don't think we've learned all the lessons from it. I don't think, and this speaks to the ability of governments, organizations to adapt to what they see. You compare, it takes two pieces. One is the ability to figure out what to do, and I think we don't lack for any ability to do that, whether it's through universities or think tanks or very sharp people. Solutions come about. It is the organization of the will to collectively carry it out and then to stay the course with one of those courses of action and to build that consensus. And I think, to your point, I don't think that we have learned those lessons in the way, say, that we did after the Great Depression, where the will was mustered in the United States, for instance, to kind of put into place different policies, new policies, a new narrative of the New Deal to really learn from what had happened and what had transpired. I don't think we've completely made that jump this time around, unfortunately.
Yeah, Zizek says it's easy to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, and which is to talk about how ingrained that system is. So to imagine its end and its alternative, I think, is so remote right now. It's almost impossible. But if there is some kind of alternative, it's going to be on the blockchain. It's going to be distributed across the network. Whatever kind of hip thing is that they're cooking up further up the coast. That's someone's utopian future. I don't know if it's coming.
Next question is on your right.
Hi, my name is Dr. Palacine, and I'm from Europe, and I have questions. Basically, my question is to the other doctor, but procreation is actually what's gotten us into this problem, because we're beyond what the Earth is capable of handling, and that's why we're having issues right now. One of the balls has dropped is climate change. You guys have mentioned it, but the problem is, how do you plan on getting the consciousness of people to actually do something about it? Because governments are not going to do anything about it. Private industry is starting to do something about it. But the thing is, everybody in this room needs to start taking action, because it's something that's already happened. We are actually past the tipping point. and unless we start to do something really radical, like mass sterilization or other dramatic things where we start to have. My question is, do you guys think that you have a way that we should start talking about actual drastic solutions that are going to take place involving technology or whatever you want, but these are the conversations that need to happen because, not to take away from what you've said, sorry, but it needs to be discussed. There needs to be solutions.
There was a recent N+1 article that talked about how we're all climate change deniers, even if we propose to say otherwise, because we keep living our lives as if nothing has changed. But in fact, real change has to be made. So do you guys have any ideas?
Thanks for the question. I guess I'm trying to talk about those kind of things in terms of this. What's required is not. We're not going to venture technology that's going to solve this issue. What's required is a paradigm shift. It's a massive cultural change, and that's why I start to talk about that. It's related to the question of value, that we need to imagine a world that isn't organized around ourselves. And for me, I'm taking very tiny little pieces out of this, little bites out of this question. But for me, that kind of cultural change can start in stories. And the reason I moved to LA and came to this town is that I think fiction and storytelling is how our culture has always shared and disseminated ideas. It's how cultural change is set in motion. What does it mean to start telling stories about the type of changes, about the radical forms of action, about the radical new forms of futures that are going to be required in order to put in order to reverse the problems that we've created for ourselves. So I'm interested in what happens when this massive machine of Los Angeles starts spinning out stories that does talk about this, that presents, why can't, when the Avengers blow up a city, why can't that city have been designed thinking about radical sustainability in mind, even though in Act 2 it's going to get blown up, but at least we could start talking about that in public terms. It shouldn't be something that happens behind the closed doors of think tanks and governments and institutions. It's something that all of us need to be part of the discussion around, which is why I'm really interested in the public agency of stories and how we should all start putting stories like this into the world as opposed to retreating and denying because they're problems which are too difficult to face.
Hi, I'm Sarah Pillsbury. I'm not a scholar. I can't tell you where I heard this theory, but it's in direct opposition to your comment that we are greedy. In other words, that the theory I've heard is that human beings operate on a system of mutual reciprocal altruism. That you're standing in front of me at Starbucks, you drop a quarter, I pick your quarter up and I give it to you, not because I think you will reward me, but because that kind of behavior will continue to be rewarded. And just to lead into sort of the paradigm shifts, the same way that we've thought about the myth of the commons was destroyed by the first woman to win the economic prize. The idea that we share a field, we're going to destroy the field. That theory has gone down. The idea that there's fight or flight, that has shifted. We now know that there's mend and attend. I think that, so for me, one of the things I've seen in the corporate world is that they are actually beginning to see that they are responsible for the messes they make. And I think that in terms of a lot of what you're talking about is how we couldn't clean up those methods. And I had this idea, could we go to a place, are we thinking about things like, I don't want to buy that product unless I know how to get rid of it. How I can just, and are people thinking along those lines, that in terms of the way things are made and the way they are delivered and what we do with them after we're done? In other words, there's no impact for it.
Yeah, certainly they are, and I'm glad you brought up the kind of corporate perspective, because I think, Eden, you wanted to touch on that a little bit, but we didn't land on it exactly. And it's interesting that to go back to that first theory that was presented, the aspect of altruism, of vested self-interest. And I think in corporations, are actually indeed starting to see, selectively, not, evenly across the board, are starting to see that there is, that there is a responsibility, that there is a need to address some of those concerns, whether it's because, just straight out of their bottom line, or because of, their overall conception of themselves and their image of themselves and their ability to sell products. I think corporations are starting to turn the corner on that. And what's curious is how governments will interact with that change. And I think it's an open question right now, but it gives me a sense of hope. I keep saying that term. It gives me a sense of hope that eyes are finally opening and people are starting to see it. Whether it comes through, whether they're convinced through storytelling, whether you're normalizing kind of this radical sustainability or whatnot, eyes are opening.
A good note to end on, hope. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I'd like to thank the Getty Center. The Getty Center, our partners and co-presenter and hosts tonight. Also thank all of you for joining us. Please stick around, grab drinks with us and our featured guests at the reception afterwards. And finally, a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much.